what is to you, in your experience and your life nowadays, is the clearest or the most significant expression of the depth of your spiritual perspective, consciousness, understanding, state?
There's no such thing. There simply is no such thing. It's the most direct and sincere thing I would say is nothing. But not nothing as no thing or none of that. There's no such thing as I can just, because if I'll go into anything as a specific, and with what you just kind of pointed, then that would betray the very essence of how life is experienced. So maybe what would be addition here is that at some point, because when you started, you spoke about this plateau experiences versus peak experiences. If this conversation were to take place, let's say some years ago, doesn't matter exactly how many, maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago, maybe the further back in time, the more eager I would be to speak about this, and the more eager I would be. And it would be easier as well. It will be, especially in the earliest years of that, when the so-called unity became stable throughout the days and throughout the repose of the sleep and the deep sleep. And we're not even talking about the witnessing state of consciousness. I had that since I remember myself as consciously experiencing something. So I would have spoken about it immediately because it's so juicy and rich and I can speak about this. But right now, I will be very honest that I cannot begin to point out what is the most significant thing. You see, you have to either push me harder or try to trip me somewhere, deliberately.
You actually gave me a very significant clue, which I'd like to follow. So I'm curious about what changed from, say, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, and how did it change? So this would be more like following a certain process, and maybe we could start with what was it? If you go back to, let's say, if I asked you this question 15 years ago, what would you say about it back then?
Well, back then, the memory would still be fresh of that intensity of spiritual breakthrough, the transformation, which has since been an ongoing lived experience for 20 years. So it would have been closer, if you see what I mean, closer in time, and also closer in terms of what follows is what I call now also a progressive refinement. A lot of the work that I do with more ready, let's say, students or beings, or some of them teachers in their own right, actually, with many more years of experience than myself. But it's that refinement of perception and progressive refinement of perception, which has to basically reevaluate, if we speak about this, then the concept of enlightenment of these very lofty terms would need to be given a very different view, and not in terms of that kind of that there's no one to get enlightened. I'm not talking about any of this borrowed from Zen, Buddhism, ready-made formulas translated into another culture, into this kind of rich culture of seeking. That the seeker is in itself a predicament. None of that. I stand on very, very, I would say, sound and solid ground of this down-to-earth perspective and approach, which validated my own experiences to such degree where I had to consciously begin to educate myself so that I can teach under that umbrella. So the Kashmir Shaivism, as an umbrella gives the possibility to speak about this state of utter and complete non-duality in relation to the reality of the world. So it's that monistic perspective here has that down-to-earth understanding, and that down-to-earth understanding is not conceptually somehow arrived at. It is my experience. It is the experience of myself as awareness, as one without a second, and that experience is not something that can be given to language, because we can speak about plateau, let alone peak experiences, but there comes a point where we cannot speak about it because language cannot take us there, simply because language would have to be of a very different kind. You see? Like it has to be a completely different kind of language to even to begin to describe this. Therefore, it would break down again and again into this commonality, something which essentially we would have to either borrow the examples of the rich vocabulary and that pool of mystical experiences from various cultures over a prolonged period of time. Mostly, I would say, fully metabolized into a creative output in the form of verse, song, in the form of poetic expression, if you will. So in other words, it cannot be spoken simply in a kind of casual dialogue. Guess what? What is that state of consciousness? How, can you give hints or insights? Yes, we can speak about realizations, insights, or even in relation to that, what I called earlier, progressive refinement. There is this also very well known, I'm sure you came across of that, is that very well known perpetual renewal of everything. Like that expansion and contraction at the infinitesimal level, which is experienced here continuously, that perpetual state of wonder is based on that. So this is why I said we would have to then lean on or draw richly from that pool of mystical experiences. You see? Otherwise, I would have to begin to invent the language. I would have to introduce my own terms, which then I would have to initiate you into these terms. So you become the insider to these terms. I just want to come and touch this as close as I can so that we don't have any maybe some So we don't have any possible error, or we not run into a possible error, that this is even a conversation topic, if you see what I mean. So this can be talked about in terms of you posing question, I'm responding to it, you remain in your comfortable position of the observer of this conversation, I in turn take the ball and throw it back to you. I just want to, right at the beginning of this conversation, mess things up a bit. You see what I mean? Because otherwise, we run, as I said, we might run straight into this predicament of assuming that we can actually talk about it. And that is only because what you said to perhaps tackle here is that how can being live itself in the body, in the human body, as a human, and what that entails. Because this is not a trivial affair. I would even say it's a terrifying affair. I'm saying that too because you have decades of spiritual fostering and worked here, and, not always said to everyone. It's a terrifying affair to be alive. There is no such thing as a rational kind of adaptation of certain arrived points of reference, and where the truth then is a pocketed experience. Far from it. So, in other words, this also presupposes an immediate actor would have to come out of its role, and completely throw that, and then who is the actor going to speak as? On whose behalf? You see, do you want me to take that mask off? Do you want me to remove that conscious things as they are arranged now in this, and just speak plainly? Then what are the consequences? Because don't forget, one of the great things about it, which also is proverbial, is there is no choice but to consciously live this in a way that one is asked of in a given sense of circumstances. Otherwise, like my teacher said, when asked, why didn't he form a relationship, or why didn't he, after all, enlightened being doesn't need to adhere to any modes of like a monk, or he simply said, who would bear this level of solitude? So the adhering back to this role is also, you see, what would make speaking about this candidly less effective. You see what I mean? Because it's not like I am now alone in the house. My wife is, she went to pick up the kids, and she will come back, and like right now I stepped out of the fatherhood or partnerhood, right? And kind of I'm just being and just sharing something. This is not what you invited me to do. You want to know, or you are interested in what is the ongoing affair for stabilized, again, the term you've used, and it's often used, stabilized level of consciousness, level that claims to be level of some degree of unity, if not a totality.
Do you feel, because you're describing yourself, you're describing a continuing process of refinement, and I think the question that kind of was in the back of my mind as you were speaking was, are you in any way actively or willfully taking part in that, or are you being pushed by that process, or pulled, or kind of, is it happening to you spontaneously and you're responding to it, or do you feel that there is a certain willful or intentional active participant aspect in that process of refinement.
I see. I think it would be more helpful to say that at some point the surrender took place where consciously that aspect that, that dance still in the dynamics of the of that apparently perceived individual and the extreme end of the universal egoity, right?
Yeah.
It delegated itself fully. So therefore, it has this already, that kind of feminine giving oneself to it. So this, I think, will be more, a sincere and more correct way to put it in terms of the way how this is. But then the participation, you see, this is where that participation in what? You see? Participation in what? In the process itself? In refinement? It's not quite in the same way, but my glasses get tinted, so I'm making a conscious act to wipe them. It doesn't work quite like that. So it's not here as something get dimmer, so I sharpen the focus, or I see reality too sharp, so I squint, so it's kind of more unified. That's not what's taking place. Does that sound?
Is there a sense of directionality?
Okay, that's interesting. Yes and no. At the level of expansion, yes, there is always directionality, but that directionality is no longer measured in terms of that what would serve here as a target, right?
Right.
Where arrow needs to hit the target.
Right.
See? Okay, let me just
It's only directionality without an object.
Without an object, it's just expansiveness here. It's this expansiveness. Well, you see again that this is why I find certain traditional insights are so helpful, because they are obviously not invented. They are based on direct inference, experience, and validation. This term Spanda that exists, if you narrow down this very, very rich tantric tradition of the Shaiva philosophy, and actually better term doctrines, then there are three principal ones. And one of them is this doctrine of Spanda. Spanda is this a throb, vibration of consciousness. So the reality is understood as the vibration of consciousness, sometimes as a heartbeat of consciousness, sometimes as a throb, as quiver. So, and also the reconciliation of the otherwise kind of illusory phenomena of the world is reconciled in positivistic terms as world is an expression of that, what is at the heart of it all. So in other words, the world is not a phenomenon of appearance in consciousness, and the appearance simply over superimposition on the account of its being superimposed, that kind of Advaitin Vedantic approach. Yeah. But instead, it's a real visceral reality of one's own self, with those helpful terms that the Shaivism operates with Shiva, which stands for pure awareness, and Shakti as that vibratory power of that awareness. It's that power. And the world, phenomenal existence, you and I, every element, the gross creation, is nothing other than the expression of these cooling down vibrations. So, with this perspective, the directive, the direction is no longer understood in terms of the goal, but rather discovered at the very heart of one's self, and as a result, at the heart of every experience. Because every experience, one way or the other, has to be made of these components, where these components, as it were, play themselves out, but collapse back onto nowhere but one's own reality of awareness. So therefore, it's more in terms of continuous tapping into that frequency of one's own power, which inevitably gives one perpetual sense of being. That is what that state here represents. And now I'm coming as close as I could to actually trying to define what you asked at the very beginning. So it doesn't have any more A to B. It has this wonder of contraction and expansion at all the levels of one's life. All the levels. Let's say, let us now speak to directly realm of human interactions. Interactions with loved one, daughter, son, spouse, anything, down to every single argument, down to every single caress and every single amorous encounter. Everything has that quality. Every sip of tea, every sip of water when one is thirsty. Every experience is pregnant with this. And this is where I don't want to kind of like throw the baby out with the bathtub. And I would say it's easier to fall into that one taste and remain in that one taste because it's somehow at the expense of the numbness, one way or the other, numbness of this, what we are equipped with, being embodied. You see? And this is a very vast terrain.
I want to understand, this is very important, what you just said. So you're saying, why don't you just say it again, and I'll try to understand it more.
Well, I would not say it again, because that doesn't work quite like that. But I will say it maybe differently. So in other words, this ebb and flow, perpetual ebb and flow, exemplified by every single breath we take and every single breath of exhalation. It's exactly how that is in terms of renewal of this, what we call existence, world. So the world collapses and rebirthed at every level of creation, at the infinitesimal level, and at the level of what we perceive here as morning to dusk, when we will kiss goodbye this day to welcome another day. A phase of our life, childhood, growing adolescence, teenage adolescence, kissing goodbye our formative years and entering the adulthood, at some point realizing that actually, that also we lived through our prime and now we're entering another phase. We're certainly physically no longer in our prime, but maybe we're somehow hoping that we are in our prime in different juices, right? So it can be seen at so many levels. These levels all overlap. At the infinitesimal level, it's taken with each breath. At the level conceivable to a human experience is at the level of this, what we call embodied life. This embodied life. How many years I've lived, and I may still live. It still has that. And yet that reality is renewed at each and every instant. And tapping into it, this is where that realization, recognition, and direct partaking in the immortality of the soul takes. It's no longer conceptual. It's no longer taken at the face of intellectual scrutiny when given this penetrating analysis of who is going to die. We're doing here at the expense of subtraction, right? The neti method. Not this, not this. We're subtracting. I'm not the body, I'm not the senses, and so forth. In this case, it's not at the expense of subtraction. It's only and always as all-embracing quality, because the subtraction doesn't need to take place. So it's no longer at the level of intellectual inquiry, whether am I actually ever going to die? Let me find out. But that we arrive at direct experience if only we pay attention to the way we even walk, sit down, have certain experience. This will open itself up and reveal itself that conscious experience of birthing, sustenance, and reabsorption, it's all there is at all times. So therefore it continuously, the world as it were, born, lives and dies at every instant, but the instant is so incomprehensible from the point of view of our day-to-day mundane perception, then it goes unnoticed. I would even say the example of the ways the films were made, where each frame of the film was a frame of the film, and then there is a gap between the frame of the film. There's nothing, there's black. Take cut and you have just that, still cut from the film. But in the motion picture, you see everything unfolds seemingly without interruption. So therefore, it's not perceptible to us where the world ceases to exist, but it ceases to exist at infinitesimal level. And that realization, what brings about this sense of timelessness, infinity, because we are constantly renewed. And this temporal playing itself out identification with the body, with the story, will of course continue play itself out. But with the expansion of consciousness, it can no longer eclipse the real state of affairs. So therefore, that fear associated with this, what has to take place, will take place, and then what is no longer there.
I want to ask you something that I'm not sure if I understood, but I think you said, is that there is an attraction to in some way be lost or be pulled into, and I don't exactly remember how you expressed it, but then you said something about the numbness that is the result of that. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to go back to that.
Let me put a bit more light, and we'll go back to that one taste and the numbness. I mean, it's not a rocket science, and it's also very well known that that one taste, or what goes under that term, one taste, this sameness of experience that is state of unity is characterized, is at the expense of the acuity of perception. And I would argue here, and I would argue the whole case here, maybe today not going into the referencing and something that to validate it, to back it up, because I'd like us to kind of maybe wrap up today's talk. The experience of that one taste deemed to be at the expense of perceptual capacity, if it is not accompanied simultaneously by aforementioned refinement of the nervous system. And very often it brings out or comes about in that aloofness, dissociation, and inability to function in the world anymore. It's a big topic because we are not only speaking here from the point of view of what real spiritual breakthrough is, how can it be measured, can it ever be measured in terms of its usability from the point of view of us as social creatures, in terms of how can this, what for so long have been spoken of in terms of the greatest affair, and yet these states of dissociation are characteristics of certain breakthroughs. And what I called earlier, that numbness that it accompanies, that numbness is not on the account of abiding in a state where everything has this sameness of experience, and at some point we begin to get kind of disillusioned. I don't know, I never read that book by Ken Wilber, but I know a lot of talks in the spiritual circles of the past approximately 10 plus years where a lot has been spoken about this as two sides of the extremes. The neurotic side of the spiritual emergency, defined by Stanislav Grof some times ago, with all the acuity of this, how nervous system can be fried and what it entails, to the very opposite of that, the sleepwalking awakened being who exhibits no interest in life and not different much in some cases from a zombie. And some people even come out and courageous enough, or something still flickers there, that prompts them to redress that. I can speak to you about some specific case studies even. Case studies that I have encountered and knew, and even, it's part of our own archival material work, where people will be confirmed in some camps with very well-known teachers, validated by very well-known teachers, as cooked, as abiding in a state, let's say, in that particular language that they use, in a state of non-dual awareness, only to realize that this is not what they intuitively feel And in one particular case, I spoke just very recently, in fact, as recent as last month, during the course that I gave. The case of an 80 years old lady when she came to me, who was with famous Indian guru Swami Muktananda in her youth, ended up being eventually with Adyashanti. And Adyashanti for 16 years, and Adyashanti confirmed that she's in that state of non-duality. But she watched an interview with me, on Buddha the Gas Pump, which no longer exists because I've been censored by that platform. Both of my interviews are being removed. And this lady experienced that reawakening in her sleep, and she wrote me a letter, and of course, came to my retreats, and I've known her for 4 years of her life. She never missed a retreat when we were in Americas. And she progresses into a real state of unity, qualitatively different. So in other words, this is where that term subtlety and refinement still has value. Because when the state of nervous system is not cultured enough, and people are trampolined, let's say, into these higher states of consciousness, without body following up, literally, without physiology following up, what happens is that it could be at the expense of either being fried, and then we'll have a case of undesirable display, which will fall under the category of any of these spiritual emergencies, right? Remember this term, that who was that? There's a poet, I think, who said, you might remember that mystics and schizophrenics, or mystics and psychopaths, share the same waters. Emerson?
Yes. I don't remember. I remember a slightly different version, which is, show me any great mystic and I will show you a madman.
Yeah, that one. But I'm talking about another one, slight different one, is that simply says that mystics share the same waters with psychopaths. The only difference is that mystics swim in these waters, while psychopaths drown in this water. Yeah. So I still don't remember the author, but it is significant here to what we speak. So one extreme would be these cases of spiritual emergencies, and on another is this extreme of total numbness to the world. And believe me, I had quite a number of cases where people would come to me specifically with this state of utter numbness, disinterest, fatigue, and shut down of this, what defeats the very, very definition of what real embodied enlightenment represents. Embodied enlightenment traditionally represented the quality of vibrancy, vibrant self. It was the very first retreat I ever gave in California. I called it vibrant self. I wanted to speak to that situation. This was 2012, I think, where I wanted to address that still scene dominated by non-duality in the Bay Area, where every county is, not county, how the Bay Area has this, Berkeley, like Marine County, yes, yeah, actually counties, yeah, like every county has dozens and dozens of its own non-dual teachers. But the field is polluted highly because of half-baked and uneducated, frankly, spiritual teachers who work from some just where that license. So that numbness here is, from my perspective, from my experience and understanding, is the result of lack of refinement in the nervous system. Because, and now we can speak about the qualities. So what qualities are here that will not create the possibility, or rather will act as a cushioning, oiling here of the process, which at times does go through this unapologetically powerful withdrawal from the worldly affairs, because consciousness would not have it. Consciousness will pull itself so forcefully in that witnessing, observing, detached, uninvolved state that no amount of excitement on the outside can do any trick. But the quality of bliss, ananda, that is one of the things that makes all the difference. So therefore, in my examination of the situation, and I'm about to, well, I have 3 books in the making, but you know how difficult it is to teach and make books. It's very contrary affair. You either teach or you write books. That's how I see it. But one of the things that I want to address, and it's a very big topic here, is the undermining in the hierarchy of spiritual movements of today, that very ancient, very traditional aspect, ananda, bliss. Bliss, because bliss here as a quality, as a substratum, it's not an added ingredient. That what makes all the difference to the ensuing of the higher states of consciousness, precisely because without bliss, our system can run dry, can become brittle, can be fried, and without the bliss, very, very often than not, all the fun is thrown out of the window. So the devastating phase of the realization will become not a phase like everything has a phase. Adolescence has a spotty phase, but then we mature into a beautiful young man or woman, And every phase has this, breaking into old age from maturity also has this, like, suddenly, and then you meet that person and it's kind of, they morphed into that old age so gracefully. You can see that everywhere in nature. So yes, there is this phase, but that's not to be taken as a given, let alone to confirm this as a, well, that's all there is to it, my dear, tough titty. And, accept it for what it is and move on, right? You wanted enlightenment, you got it now. Nothing to write home about. Couldn't be further from the truth. Why? Because really, all, as far as the tantric tradition is concerned, and tantric here, Vedic, it's all the same. All this is about bliss. Ananda is the most powerful of all the operating powers of awareness, because it's the Ananda Shakti.
Can I ask you something about bliss or Ananda? In my experience, I experience bliss that is connected to being wholeheartedly, lovingly involved in life. And there seemed to be a different kind of bliss which is pulling me toward what I would call death, or the emptiness of nothingness. So these to me have slightly different qualities, or they're like 2 different types of bliss. And I wonder if you also have the same experience of a bliss of life and a bliss of, I don't know if to call it death, but nothingness.
Okay, well, let's not complicate this, right? Because this is experiential, and since it is experiential, also there are times and moments and points when we experience that at the expense of another experience, which experience becomes more dominant. yes, in meditation and meditative absorptions, there are withdrawals, these states of integration or samadhi or nirvana, whatever respective tradition may call it. There are this withdrawal of that integration, absorption is so intense that is experienced as nothingness, because it's at the expense of cognitive powers. No cognition is functioning. So it's the highest forms of samadhi I experienced. Samadhis, or these withdrawals, absorptions, without any cognition. And in these states of absorption, we touch viscerally to the substratum of creation, which is bliss. That Satchitananda is not just a Hindu invention. That Satchitananda is being, consciousness, bliss. Because that what we speak about, what we try to articulate, narrate, approximate, coming nearer, is always there. So therefore, it's a fundamental quality of being. It's always conscious, and it's always full of its own bliss. So therefore, in Hindu-based spiritual traditions, Satchitananda has that importance that is irrespective of variety of traditions, whether this is Dvaita or Advaita tradition, whether this tradition is emphasizing feminine aspect of the divine or masculine aspect of the divine. Satchitananda is always there. So this bliss, that Ananda quality, has been undermined in a lot of modern spirituality. And I have my own, and it's not just my own, it's a very, very clear, this is a colonization of spiritual teachings. And though we are out of the age of imperialism, intellectual imperialism continues. So this patriarchal way of interpreting these spiritual traditions continues. My take on Neo-Advaita and non-duality is misappropriation of these very, very refined spiritual teachings that arose in the Indian subcontinent for millennia, culminating in the so-called classical systems of Indian philosophy, as darshanas are known for, are being completely given a blind eye for the emphasis and insistence of that one taste, or that non-duality state, where all that refinement of the tradition is thrown out of the window. And with that aforementioned quality of Ananda. So therefore, we have quite a disproportionate number of so-called awakened, and in many cases, legitimately could be spoken of as awakened beings out there, in whom consciousness is certainly no longer dormant. Yet, they are as miserable as they are. Depressed and on pills. I mean, Amir, this is a serious situation we're speaking about here. Spiritual awakening renders someone invalid in terms of their affairs in this shared reality that certainly, from the perspective where I speak and relate to, never spoken of as nothing. So this, speaking about bliss, speaking about, so if there is, that quality is not there, it can be a very ruinous and a detriment of what we call happiness. And if we bring it down now, kind of like just have it just really like, as you said, pal-to-pal conversation, just human to human, all this is boiled down to nothing other than reclaiming that what is lost, paradise always been, is reclaiming that state of fullness, happiness. Happy people don't turn reality into a miserable affair. So world adjusts itself, existence, everyone does the right thing and everything follows its course when there is happiness. It's very simple. It's almost too simple. And going to the question specifically whether this is so in terms of the quality. So yes, there are many different qualities of that bliss, that ananda. There are many. Some traditions are painstaking in describing anandas, starting from the ananda pertinent to the sensory perception. Strawberry in the mouth, ice cream in the mouth, favorite beverage, you name it, is accompanied by that release, which is ananda. And then the degrees and the gradations are becoming subtler and subtler. When ananda has nothing to do, its entanglement with sensory perception is no longer there. It can still be ananda of that refined, when thinkers, philosophers, they have, love of wisdom after all, is not a dry affair. The root term of the philosophy is very beautiful. So they have everyone who, every real man of wisdom, woman of wisdom, man of wisdom, know that also that quality of bliss that is accompanied by refined state of thinking. But then it goes beyond that, beyond sensory, mental, and emotional states. And of course, it goes into this most refined of all the states, like all the way to the Jagatnananda and Brahmananda. There's all this ananda of one's own self, or ananda of the absolute, or that universal ananda, which is no longer pertinent to the neurophysiological activity of the body and all its components. So how one is experiencing that's a marvel. What is experiencing? How can that experience be translated into a human body? This is the frontier. Because it is still experienced here as a point in time. You see? So it is transcendent and immanent at once. So this is where we're coming a bit closer to the very, very mystery of incarnation. Word becoming flesh, becoming closer to that incarnated realm of who we are as human beings, where that immanent and that transcendent not only can mingle, but can coexist, and as extreme poles of experience, one give rise to another.